All right, wonderful. Well, dear guests, dear colleagues, dear friends, welcome to day 2 of our midterm conference on the right to international protection, a pendulum between globalization and nativization. My name is Idil Atak. I'm one of the co-organizers of this conference. I'm based in Toronto, Canada. I would like to hand things over to Professor Elspeth Giles, who will chair our next panel. Elspeth, over to you.
Thank you so much, Idil, and also to the whole team in Toronto and in Bergen, and to Hakan for a terrific day yesterday. This has been such an interesting event, and I've learned so much and found it absolutely fascinating. I'm delighted to be chairing our plenary policy forum today. And we have an absolutely outstanding lineup of speakers. As you are all aware, we are facing not only what we would consider the day-to-day issues and problems in respect of protection of refugees, but we also have a crisis in Afghanistan, which has captured an awful lot of media attention, but is playing out at the moment primarily in the region with tremendous pressures on neighboring states, which have been host states for quite some time in respect of refugee protection. It is a great pleasure to introduce my speakers. We have the Chief of Section of Protection Policy, Madeleine Garlick, who is going to start. She has written an astonishingly interesting book on solidarity in respect of the common European asylum system, something which continues to be extraordinarily timely for those of us who are on the European continent, and is currently, has been an incredibly important actor in the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees, and a person who is among the keys in terms of the effective application and implementation, notwithstanding certain criticisms that we heard yesterday from our keynote speaker. The consequences are indeed impressive already. Our second speaker is Catherine Willard, Secretary General of the European Commission for Refugees and Exiles, a fantastically well-informed, knowledgeable, and influential person on the European scene, independent from the EU institutions, but has the ear of every single EU institution, as well as a foothold in many of the international institutions and at the European level. Her institution is an umbrella NGO or civil society actor, as the language is beginning to change, which is extremely influential in promoting and protecting the rights of refugees and displaced persons from the perspective of Europe. And this is not just the European Union, but the wider Europe, including the Council of Europe. Our third speaker is a delight to introduce. I'm sure no introduction is actually needed for François Crépeau. He is, of course, a professor at McGill University, a very prestigious named chair, and also one of the most influential of the former special rapporteurs. His role was in particular special rapporteur for the rights of migrant workers and their families. But during his period, his 2 mandates at the UN, he was one of the people who brought the special rapporteurs together on the principle of common action, common points of convergence in their reports, and common immediate reactions to challenging situations where human rights are at risk on the ground. And we have seen the framework which François put into place at the UN already at work with special rapporteurs presenting a common front in respect of Afghanistan. So we have a fantastically interesting lineup. of people who are at the cutting edge of policymaking around the world. And I would like to start off with giving the handing over to Madeleine to make her presentation. As I understand it, Madeleine and Catherine do not have PowerPoints, but we'll finish up with a PowerPoint from Francois. So Madeleine, over to you. It is a pleasure to introduce you.
Thank you very much, Elspeth, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. And let me extend my thanks to Ryerson and to the wider PROTECT Consortium membership for inviting me to take part today. And let me also really congratulate you on the work done so far, about which we heard some fascinating insights from the work package presentations yesterday. As an important starting point in this discussion on policy today, I'd like to commend in particular the PROTECT project's focus on identifying and examining the roles, strengths, and contributions of various different actors, including amongst other civil society organizations, different institutional actors in different institutional frameworks, citizenry in asylum countries, and of course, refugees and displaced people themselves. I think this is absolutely crucial because it's starkly apparent today that neither UNHCR nor other parts of the UN, regional entities or individual states can address the challenges of refugee protection today alone, not to mention those around strengthening migration governance and management while safeguarding the rights of all people on the move. It has to be a much wider set of actors who can, and indeed do, contributing to reinforcing responses to the vast challenge of refugee protection and addressing human mobility in today's conditions. These challenges are vast, let us be clear, and we need to be more effective, all of us, in coming up with new and adaptable solutions to these. But it has to be a collective effort. Because otherwise I think it's tempting to seek to lay the blame to some of the failures of international protection that we see today at the feet of UNHCR, including for what some see as the insufficient ambition of the Global Compact on Refugees, as Professor Hathaway so eloquently did yesterday. In his very stimulating and thought-provoking presentation, he of course also attributed responsibility to HCR for failing to garner support for his ideas for a refugee allocation scheme of 25 years ago, with all of the unanswered questions of principle and practicality around them, a number of which were raised by some of the conference participants in the discussion. But amongst the other points that yesterday's discussion highlighted through into sharp relief, I think the fact remains that we have at the moment limited will on the part of states currently to assume new binding legal commitments to a refugee redistribution scheme or other overarching framework. So against that background, what are we to do? In the face of some of the most challenging disgracement crises of recent history now unfolding, including from Afghanistan with its immediate but also long-standing tragic aspects, but also Ethiopia, Syria, Myanmar, Venezuela, and others. I think we need to continue to focus on the challenge of responsibility sharing, something that Professor Hathaway, of course, and many other parts of yesterday's speaking agenda highlighted, on responsibility sharing and finding better ways to ensure that we can mobilize will to do so. Allow me to highlight 6 areas that I see as potentially crucial priorities in this regard, many of which reflect some of the points of emphasis and aims of the different PROTECT projects activities for the months to come. Firstly, it seems crucial at this point to seek to maximize the potential of the global compacts as they stand. They are, after all, key soft law instruments, which, though not legally binding, have significant potential to influence the interpretation and application of binding obligations, as mentioned yesterday in the discussion of Work Package 2 on legal dimensions. In yesterday's discussion, it was highlighted that these are not regressive, meaning that it needs to be recognized and understood that the compacts can provide a basis for highest legal standards than those already in place, but they don't admit of lower scope for lower standards of implementation. As regards international protection, the Global Compact on Refugees complements the 1951 Convention on International Human Rights Law, specifically by seeking to address some concrete activities linked to better implementation of some of the binding legal provisions in international law. But they cannot be legally lawfully invoked to undermine them, as Professor Brass agreed yesterday. The global compacts are not the panacea to all of the ills of the international protection regime or modern migration challenges, which is why critical scrutiny and discussion of the kind that we're seeing in this event are going to be so important. They may also not represent the ideal to which some protection advocates have aspired, but they have the endorsement of the vast majority of member states of the United Nations, and they do set out some important new elements that are not otherwise in widely ratified international instruments. I would argue, therefore, that supporters of refugee protection and migrants' rights will have an interest in looking to enhance their potential rather than dismissing them, which can potentially simply feed into the intransigence and the nativism of some states that are wishing to justify more restrictive standards and deterrence agendas in the face of new developments. Secondly, I think it's important for us to look at engaging more concretely in the many issues that are touched upon the compacts, which are not explicitly addressed by the existing asylum or migration legal frameworks, but many of which are critical to the effective enjoyment of our rights in practice. The Global Compact on Refugees refers to some important tools that are foreseen to reinforce responsibility sharing and provide a platform for this to be carried out more predictably and sustainably, including, amongst others, support to early warning, preparedness and contingency planning amongst states that could receive significant numbers of arrivals, gathering of accurate data and evidence on a more widespread basis to enhance the quality of responses, but also to strengthen policy making and indeed advocacy, support to capacity development and others. It directly addresses reception and admission to territory, meaning that it does not neglect the issue of access, as might have been suggested recently. And it also links to statelessness, a crucial issue for so many displaced, which consigns them in many cases to denial of rights and to lack of access to mainstream national services. It also looks at energy, national resources, food security, and other issues that are essential for the enjoyment of basic rights in many states today. The PROTECT project, as we understand, is working on a handbook for practitioners on how to use the global compacts, which we consider to be a potentially crucial tool to ensure that the many diverse aspects of these compacts are going to be addressed in daily practice by the competent authorities in many states. And this will be a very important contribution to the understanding and awareness of the potential of these provisions. As a third area, I think it's crucial for us to look at ways to strengthen their supervision and compliance. As was noted yesterday, some instruments which are not binding have the potential to have greater impact than those which are, where they have truly effective supervision and compliance monitoring. It's crucial for us to seek to ensure this for the global compacts as well. The more than 1,000 pledges that were made in connection with the Global Forum on Refugees should not be allowed to just remain as promises on paper. States have committed to change their laws and practice in many instances, and it's important for all of us to hold them to account for those commitments. We've seen some which have taken important promising steps, including amending laws to afford access to labour markets for refugees, creating stateless determination procedures. And in the case of some very important legal aid providers from civil society and the private sector to providing thousands of hours of legal support. These things can make a real difference to the lives of people who are striving to get access to the rights that binding instruments provide to them. HCR should be held to account for pushing states and other actors to do what they've committed to do. But at the same time, partners, advocates, and many others are well placed also to monitor this and to press for their fulfillment in practice in some of the current challenging contexts in which we see refugee challenges portrayed most clearly. As a fourth area, it's crucial for us, however, at the same time to continue to pursue the development and application of binding legal instruments. This includes accession to binding treaties. The most recent state to accede to the 1951 convention was South Sudan, approximately 2 years ago. It's true that the case needs to be made as to why this is going to bring benefits to states and not merely pose challenges. But that's incumbent upon all of us who are monitoring refugee law practice and who can seek to identify instances where good practices in managing and dealing with the challenges around refugee protection have accrued to those states who have engaged in positive practice. There's also judicial engagement, which can provide a crucial way through national and regional courts in particular to ensure that states are held to account for their refugee convention, but also regional and national legal commitments as well. Fifthly, it's important for us to look at further ways to improve the coherence and the positively dynamic interaction between the two compacts. There are dialogue and linkages, which we see ongoing, including through the UN Migration Network, of which UNHCR is a member of its executive committee. We see many states engaging with both, and notwithstanding some of the resistance amongst states to the Global Compact on Migration, we now have some 32 champion countries who are working with the UN to look at taking forward actions around the various objectives of the Migration Compact. These have the potential to make a really important difference to states that have been struggling with migration challenges and large arrivals for many years. It's important in this connection to recognize the distinctions between the two compacts, but also their mutually reinforcing aspects, and seek to ensure that this can be transformed into something positive as regards action and advocacy around immigration detention, for instance, grappling with human smuggling and trafficking, which affect, of course, refugees and migrants, and which are challenges that states acknowledge. There is a need for more effective ways forward. Sixthly, I think it's really crucially important for us to seek to draw on the compacts in seeking to address today's immediate crises. Afghanistan, as we have just been saying, is a towering emergency, and the plight of those fleeing is as urgent as it's tragic. We need to be helping the states in the region, which are hosting Afghan refugees already and receiving thousands more, to be confident that they aren't going to be expected to continue to maintain these populations without sufficient support on an indefinite basis. If not, the consequences in terms of onward movement and human misery are going to be clear. We also need, at the same time, to already be looking to try and lay the foundation for more solutions, even as the emergency is at its height. We can't afford more protracted refugee situations, with some half of the world's refugee population already displaced for more than 5 years. This means working to try and ensure decent treatment and conditions at the most mundane level, including drawing on some of the formulas and proposals that the compacts contain. I look forward very much to hearing what some of my fellow panelists have to say on all of this, but let me conclude by simply saying that it's crucial for us indeed again to look at ways in which empirical research can enhance our perspectives on this. Too much of the political rhetoric we hear around migration and refugees are informed by nationalistic perspectives that are not based in fact. So again, projects such as that which PROTECT is seeking to take forward can only inform discourse, dialogue, and thinking on this in important, positive ways. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Madeleine, for a really excellent summary of where we are and the challenges that we're facing. And I particularly appreciate the way you have brought in the theoretical framework of PROTECT, which Professor Sergio Carrera set out yesterday, that the voices against migration or against reception of refugees are in fact only part of a much wider landscape. And in the graphs which he showed, in fact, we see that the majority of people in the countries where the questionnaires and the polling took place support enormously refugee protection. It's just that we have a popular media which gives undue emphasis to perhaps some voices which express views which the international community has clearly stated in conventions and most recently in the compacts as being incompatible with our understanding of the right to dignity. Let me hand over now to Catherine Willard. You are presenting a perspective from a part of the world which doesn't have a very good reputation. The incumbent special representative on the rights of all migrant workers and their families spent a very large part of his report in June attacking the European Union. And in a number of discussions I've had recently with EU officials, references to that report keep coming up as sort of a little bit like unexpected burps that, you know, the officials don't want to say it, but they can't resist. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you so much. And first of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to join PROTECT events, and this one included. I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because unfortunately I wasn't able to join you yesterday. I have, though, come up with some comments on the preliminary findings, but based on the written material and the short videos that were prepared by work package leaders, rather than what sounds to have been quite an interesting debate yesterday. In fact, I'll probably listen to the recordings on the basis of the reviews that have come in. So for now, we've been asked to comment on two elements: current priorities in governance of international protection and the rights of forced migrants, and the preliminary findings from PROTECT. So I'll first outline three priorities now, and then identify some of the preliminary findings from PROTECT, which seem to be rather promising in relation to those priorities. The three priorities are in turn legal, operational and practical, and political. So one of each. I put together the operational and practical considerations. So looking at these priorities, first priority, a legal one. If we're talking generally priorities for governance of international protection as the subject of the conference. And the first priority, a legal one, let me put this bluntly: prevention of legal reform in the area of refugee law and protection. Now, that may sound rather strongly worded. We all know that there are many flaws in national, European and international refugee law, and in the consistency between those different legal orders. I think we could all develop our fantasy new or amended conventions covering international protection. Unfortunately, it's just too risky to do so. Reforms to legal frameworks in recent years have largely gone in a negative direction, eroding protection standards. And there is a risk that opening up international refugee law would also reduce protection standards. In the EU, at the heart of ECRE's work, is the question of the Common European Asylum System. And we've seen extensive reform proposals in 2016 and then last year, 2020, with the Pact. And those proposals undermine protection standards, notwithstanding certain small improvements. At the same time, they don't address the legal flaws in those frameworks. I think it's well established that any opening up of the convention would lead to a reduction in standards, so I won't go into that. As a caveat, we are talking about reform here. Of course, there are many situations in which protection regimes still need to be established in law, and that I think is something distinct. I note, though, that in some regions, particularly those regions and countries that are on a route that people take in order to get to Europe, there's actually a disincentive to countries in establishing legal standards because of the risk that they may be classed as safe countries, safe third countries of asylum, safe first countries of asylum, etc., for the purposes of Europe's agenda. One example right there, a contemporary example that we're dealing with, or at least commenting on right now, is the situation of Afghans in Turkey, for example. The impediment to the expansion of the EU-Turkey deal, one impediment, the legal impediment, let us say, because there are also political and never mind ethical impediments, but as a legal impediment, of course, the absence of a meaningful international protection regime for Afghans and all the other nationalities in Turkey that aren't either covered by the restricted interpretation of the convention or the temporary protection regime for those leading Syria renders that legally impossible. And there, of course, then is no incentive for that to be improved beyond the international protection regime, as it is called, but as we know, is very far off convention level standards, which should be the measure. So in this priority, we end up talking about a defense of the status quo and prevention of further erosion of standards. The second priority is an operational and practical one, which is implementation of the standards that exist. Here we refer to implementation of the standards in international law and in the authoritative guidance from UNHCR and other sources on interpretation of international law, and then other sources that may be said to supplement legal regimes. This is done through increasing knowledge, institution building, and in our view, there's particular value to identifying implementation gaps and then attempting to tackle them one by one. In many situations globally, refugee status determination may be a key implementation gap when it comes to standards. In Europe, we, through our analysis through the AIDA database, we've identified particular implementation gaps. I would say that one area currently is access, as we all know, and there we refer to the undermining of Article 31, but also to EU law provisions on access. And beyond that, we then have other implementation gaps that we've identified specifically. I'll come back to this in the second in the conclusions on PROTECT's role. The third priority is a political one. Let me also rather provocatively call this one the complicity of the centre. This conference refers to nativization. I would suggest instead using the term nativism. It's not the process of renationalization as such that is the risk, although we do see that happening in Europe. And we do see a generalized disregard for international law, which some may describe as a process of nativization. Rather, the threat that we see is nativism in an ideological sense, linked to a narrow form of nationalism, and one that is very far from enlightened self-interest forms of nationalism. A nationalism which only values the citizens of that nation, not those arriving, whatever the circumstances of their arrival, and places the citizens of that nation above all others. In a sense, it's anti-humanist, it's anti-globalist, but it has at its heart an attack on the universality of human rights. And this is, I think, our understanding of much of what's happening in Europe. It's not necessarily a rejection of human rights per se, it's a rejection of the principle of universality. That, of course, that is one and the same thing, but worth unpicking. Nonetheless, I think we're all familiar with the debate about the role of the far right in Europe. The priority, in our view, is tackling the complicity of the centre. The far right parties, the nativists, the extremists, whatever we want to call them, they're always there. Unfortunately, they've been part of Europe's political landscape. Even in the post-war period, there were revivalist extreme right parties in Germany, for instance, I mean, across the continent. I think what we're concerned about is the approach of many mainstream political parties, technocrats, functionaries, institutions that go along with this agenda while denying it. We see a proliferation of self-defeating, unfeasible, unworkable, contradictory and counterproductive proposals from the centre, often based on a doomed effort to control the uncontrollable, to find solutions to complex phenomena, phenomena that contain good, bad and inevitable elements that aren't problems to be resolved. Currently, we have the debate about return, deportation as the solution to the dysfunctional aspects of the European asylum policy. We have the debate about Turkey and the EU-Turkey deal as a solution, as a way to manage the situation. For going back over the last 5 to 6 years, we have the approach of saying we must defend refugee protection, but we must end irregular arrivals. Managing the situation through doing that impossible thing, which undermines the very principle it's supposed to defend, is put forward by the centre and by mainstream politics. So let me leave that aside and just conclude with reference to some of the findings from PROTECT that look intriguing and useful in terms of tackling these priorities. I'll just add a small caveat here as well. Whenever we look at research findings as an NGO and an alliance of NGOs, we quickly scan through and try to find what provides evidence to support our position. As ECRI, we do a lot of our own research, notably in the IDA database and in legal notes, but we also do a lot of polemic, and we also do a lot of litigation, and both of which require evidence from elsewhere. So we look at these kind of research projects as a way to find evidence that justifies what we're saying. I'm sorry if that sounds cynical and undermines the very nature of academic research, but there you are. Very quickly, findings that look interesting. Work package 2. I think the first priority, legal reform. There are interesting findings coming out about the usefulness of the GCM. And the fact that in some ways it may be more useful than the GCR, including on protection. And I think using lessons from the previous non-binding instruments which created change, which is part of the discussion in that work package, I think is quite fruitful. This is not to criticize the GCR. The point of it is to defend and not open up the convention. And it plays that role. I think the work on the compatibility of the GCR with existing legal frameworks will allow us to revisit and refresh the debate on, for instance, EU asylum law and the convention. And the relevance of the GCR, I think, very much lies in operational, logistical and practical tools that come out of the CRRF framework, rather than in terms of its impact on legal standards. It's reinforcing the convention, that's the point. Work package 3, I think there's very interesting findings in relation to the practical and operational challenge of implementation. In particular, the work that's done in that package on institutional architecture and the exploration of recognition rates, what asylum offices are doing, and tracing back the increasing role of ministries of the interior. I found that extremely useful because in our analysis, the dominance of ministries of the interior is one of the key problems in this issue. And looking back at the fact that it was not always the case, and you see up until actually quite recently, the stronger role for foreign ministries and of course for UNHCR, I think is extremely interesting and leads to other recommendations on institutions. Work package 4, for priorities 2 and 3, the emerging findings on vulnerability I found particularly interesting. And here we're already concerned about the impact of some of the current debate on vulnerability, which is exemption of the vulnerable only from restrictive measures. And the risk that actually in our own work, we may be exacerbating a situation where protection is undermined because, for instance, in litigation, we focus on vulnerable cases. And there is a general move towards a situation where only the vulnerable will have access to rights. And there is a risk that we're complicit in this. I think the findings on that some of the approaches to vulnerability facilitate this approach is important. On civil society work package 4, I have to say I simply look forward to hearing more about this. One of the conclusions is that civil society is an essential part of the landscape. Glad to hear it, but also that we're agents for change. Honestly, right now, we don't feel that. We feel like we're having very little impact. And so I was simply from a self-interested perspective, I would look forward to seeing the evidence on which those conclusions are based. Finally, work package 3 on priorities, on public opinion. I think this relates to the political question and the complicity of the centre. The public opinion findings tend to reinforce the point also made by Hakan, that public opinion is not as negative as we're led to believe by politicians. And this is why we call the strategy of the mainstream self-defeating, because it doesn't lead to more votes, or why we need additional analysis and not to trust the reference to this is what the public wants. Political fragmentation in Europe, including the fact that you may be the largest party with just 11–15% of the vote, is what is leading to this radicalization of the centre, this extremist positioning by the centre. And I think the findings there tend to confirm and look in more detail and are more robust than findings in this area that we already have access to. A final note on the media, I was quite reassured by some of the analysis of media coverage, and specifically that actually this issue is not in the media as much as we think. And that may be ironic in the sense that usually when you're an advocate, you want your issue to be in the media. I think with everything to do with asylum and migration in Europe, salience leads to problems. It leads to extreme right voting and positioning. So as not the main finding that the work package wanted to prepare, but one that I've taken out. Thank you. I apologize for being a bit long there. I didn't have time to do a run through before.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And your comments are particularly interesting and pertinent to the whole of the PROTECT project. And we're very grateful to you for having had a look at each of the work packages in respect of what everyone's up to. And I certainly agree with you. I've come to the point where I think perhaps less publicity is more helpful than more publicity, but that's just the final point where you left off. Francois, can I hand over to you to wrap up this policy panel from the perspective of our formal presentations? And I know you have a PowerPoint for us.
Yes, I have. I first want to thank Idil for inviting me and the whole PROTECT team, and to say that I'm part of the sister project called Vulner on the vulnerability of migrants and refugees. I missed yesterday. That was the last day of my holidays, and I hope I won't be repeating things that have been said. And maybe people like Idil and Sergio and Elspeth have heard me say a few things that I'm going to say. I'm going to take you to 30,000 feet because I think it's important to see where we're going and not simply have our nose into what we're doing now. And I will talk about the role in particular of the Global Compact on migration. I'm sharing my screen now. Yeah. And this. Yeah, here. So the idea is the idea of the Global Compact is to facilitate human mobility. And to me, that is something that we have to keep in mind. And we have to say that within 30 to 50 years, this is what we want to happen. So I'm going to start with a few things that all of you know, but I would like to tie them together and put them in the framework so that the Global Compact can be better understood. We know about the push factors, and including survival migration, that includes refugees and asylum seekers, but also include many temporary migrants and undocumented migrants. We talk much less about the pull factors, the responsibility of host states for fueling movements towards their economies. It's certainly safety for refugees, but it's labor needs at all skills levels in non-delocalizable industries in most of host countries, North and South. And those needs are often not mentioned. They're often, put to the side and not discussed, and we need to discuss them. Migrants' precarity is a construction. It's a social, political, legal construction. Migrants, and that includes asylum seekers, not necessarily when they cross the border from their home country, but afterwards, when they are trying to find a place where they can create a life for themselves and their children. Migrants come because of labor markets. And we have, in many host countries, including mine, we have many sectors of the industry, thanks to globalization, that their competitiveness rests on cheap labor. These sectors are non-delocalizable. We can't, delocalize Quebec strawberries to Guatemala. They have low profit margins, and we know what they are. They have been researched extensively. and there's very little oversight in those sectors. And so we have this combination of migration policies and labor policies that create dangerous employment relationships. We know that. Based on the precarity of status, the fear of return, and that's true for asylum seekers, but that's also true for undocumented migrants and temporary migrant workers who have incurred debts and will face violence if they don't repay those debts. And so these migrants, all these migrants with little social capital and little options in life must accept the working conditions that they're offered. And that's the key point to sustain those industries that we have decided need cheap labor. And so we have this strategy to reduce labor costs. And that's the policies against undocumented migration. We're knowingly blocking low-wage migrants, despite the fact that we know are clear, unacknowledged labor needs. And we repress that repression of undocumented migration, silences undocumented migrants. They can't protest. They're pushed further underground in the hands of those that exploit them, the employers, the lodgers, the loan sharks, the smugglers, etc. And therefore, the prohibitionist system we have established creates, entrenches, and subsidizes underground markets. We are, in great part, the cause of these migration movements, undocumented migration movements that we are, despising, and that we say we don't want, but in fact, we want them. Every time a minister of immigration says, I'm going to stop this once and for all, industries whisper in his or her ear, yes, but not too much. We still need people to come in. Temporary labor migration programs mimic to a certain extent that mechanism of undocumented migration, and especially single employer temporary status like kafala system or sponsorship in Canada. Standards are not applied, inspections are absent, unionization is discouraged or prohibited. Do you know that in Canada, agricultural workers in Quebec and Ontario are prohibited from unionizing, which is a violation of ILO conventions? Protesting is punished, you're returned, so you don't protest. And asylum seekers are part of that. They're often pushed on the ground. They face precarity. Many are unrecognized. Many have no right to work or very little right to work or late right to work. And therefore, they are all treated as undesirable migrants, undesirable until they produce wealth for their employers. And precarity is bolstered by political discourses. There's no, and it's not irresponsible, it's not because politicians are irresponsible. There's no political responsibility for the bad portrayal of migrants. And I think that's what Catherine was saying, complicity of the center. Electoral democracy does not represent migrants, they don't vote, they can't punish politicians, they can't reward politicians either. And therefore we have migration policies which are made by non-migrants, the politicians, essentially for non-migrants, their electorates. And the migrants themselves don't bring the reality check to this policy making because they don't count. Migration policies are often, not always, but often based on nationalist populist myths and stereotypes and fantasies that continue to be constructed and are not contradicted by the center, because there's no gain to be made electorally by having in most countries, having a pro-immigration stance. And that started when I was a student in Paris. I remember Laurent Fabius, who was Prime Minister of France at the time, saying, Monsieur Le Pen asks the right questions, but bring forward the wrong answers. And by saying that Le Pen was asking the right questions, Fabius, a socialist, was essentially endorsing the analysis of the right of the extreme right on migration issues. And that to me struck me at the time, and it still strikes me. And that I like Catherine's word of complicity of the center because of that. We use a language which is totally inappropriate towards migrants, like we use an inappropriate language about women or about LGBTQ community in the not that distant past. We use a criminal language, criminal standards, And we need to change that. We need to educate the majorities and count on what Catherine was mentioning, the fact that public opinion is not that hostile to migrants, contrary to what politicians would like us to think. Now, there has been work towards changing that. In the SDGs, migrants and human rights have been included when they had been forgotten in the Millennium Development Goals by using, as you see on the screen, the idea of for all women and girls, decent work for all, reduce inequality, justice for all, etc. And there were specific targets, and especially 8.8 and 10.7, protect labor rights for all workers, including migrant workers, in particular women migrants. And it's quite, powerful words here, and facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility of people. To me, these are two objectives that are key. And the second objective has been developed in the Global Compact, and you've discussed the Global Compact. I just want to emphasize the fact that the Global Compact is not the dream of a mad professor or the the ecstatic dream of a civil society organization. It was negotiated, discussed, and adopted by states. States decided that this was what needs to be done, and we had many, the vast majority of states of the UN General Assembly that adopted it. It was negotiated by civil servants and diplomats with the help of experts, international organizations, civil society organizations, academics, and it was negotiated discreetly before, under the radar screen of politicians. Politicians reacted at the end when signing the Global Compact came into view. But politicians, these diplomats, I'm talking about the diplomats and civil servants, they knew what was the way forward, and they set it up. Politicians have, caught up, and many of them have denounced the Global Compact, but not all of them. And this is what needs to be done. It's not perfect, and it's certainly contrary to what most host states' practices are, but we have to think in terms of long-term influence. We have to equate the Global Compact to the Universal Declaration, which has the same status. It's a resolution of the General Assembly. It took, we're still developing the Universal Declaration, over 70 years. And I think the Global Compact will probably have that. And the central recommendation of the Global Compact is the word facilitate, which is used 62 times in the Global Compact. And to me, that's key. It's in the English negotiated version. If you look at translations, it's different because they use different words. But in the English negotiated version, 62 times it says facilitate. It's not an oversight. So I'm going through very quickly a number of things. Pathways for regular migration. We've talked about that for years, but it's there, including the right to family life, expanding family reunification. Family unity, the right to family life, linked to the principle of the best interest of the child. Foster family reunification. We hear so many politicians who want to reduce family reunification. Decent work conditions, like was said in the SDGs, guarantee decent work condition, guarantee recruitment, ethical recruitment, fair recruitment. Make easy the change of employers and the modification of the conditions or length of their stay, transitioning between statuses as well. Make that easy. In many countries, including my own, it can take months. And migrants in general, including asylum seekers, do not have the money nor the incentive to wait for months. And so they're often pushed into the underground because they don't have other options. And it's written here, without fear of arbitrary expulsion, which is, regularization. The word disappeared. It was in the zero draft of the GCM. It's disappeared through the negotiation because states didn't like that. But it's funny because in the French translation, they reintroduced it. So in the French official translation, you have the word régularisation. But the wording is a bit convoluted, but the idea is there. Regularize most migrants who are working, who have established their lives, who have kids. Make it easy for them. This is key for the discussion we're having. Crisis preparedness, emergency response, post-crisis action. We need to see emergency preparedness for migration like we see it for floods and for forest fires. It is something for which we need to plan in advance, have investments ready, and be ready. I'll come back to that. Access to public services. Look at the wording. All migrants, regardless of their migration status, that includes asylum seekers and refugees, have safe access to basic services. I mean, this is important that states have adopted this, and they've even adopted, without using the word was in the zero draft and it disappeared, the word firewalls. But the paragraph is still there, a bit convoluted again, but the paragraph is still there, having firewalls to make sure that people who have rights can exercise those rights without interference from immigration enforcement. And that is key. And we know that in many countries, this idea of firewalls has been rejected by politicians. Have inclusive and cohesive societies. Look at the words on the second line. Empowering migrants. It's the first time in a negotiated agreement that I see the idea that you have empowering migrants, because the whole idea of migrants' precarity is based on disempowering them, not allowing them to protest, to contest, to go to court. And to me, that is key. Here we have empowering migrants, making sure that they can defend themselves, because in the end, it's the only thing that works. You know, women have defended their own rights. They were not given their rights on a silver platter by men. They had to fight for them. Well, migrants do not have the tools to fight for that because they don't have citizenship, they can't vote, they can't push, and they are silenced by prohibition. Change perceptions, generate a more realistic, humane perception of migrants, and recognition of skills. So all this is what international organizations, civil society organizations, experts have said for many years, and states have accepted that. The vast majority of states of the UN have accepted that as the way forward. Now, it's not perfect, and I have a list here of things that are not well discussed, and most importantly, I would say the next to last, there's no mention of the exploitative labor markets in host states, which is one of the key pull factors for migration, undocumented and temporary migrants, and asylum seekers. You know, the 2015 people wanted to go to Germany, not Portugal. So what do we need? What's the way forward? And I think, to me, it's long-term strategic planning of mobility, integration, diversity policies over 20, 30, 50 years. We do that for all other aspects of government. We do that for energy, infrastructure, healthcare, education. We plan ahead in order to have a timeline for investments, for you know, organization of the state. We need to plan. We need to know when a highway will be necessary, where it will go, so that we can say, okay, we'll need in 20 years from now to invest here. And that's, to me, that means we need to discuss that with everyone, with all departments, with all the population, etc., to see what are going to be the needs. And we need, and to me, that is the idea of facilitating. We need to allow more migrants to come and look for work and come back and go back and come back. For many years in the 50s, 60s, 70s, migrants could do that easily across borders. And they came when there were jobs for them, and often, as the Mexicans in the US, went back to Mexico when they lost their job and came back when the cousin called and said there's a new job in Chicago, etc. So this is and it served the American economy quite well. So we need to develop what the EU is doing as visa facilitation liberalization regimes, but with bigger countries than what the EU has been doing recently. We aim for an open and regulated movement, and the ultimate objective is to make mobility easier, safer, cheaper, faster. This is what the EU's, you know, freedom of movement policy was based on. And it works. It works for the EU. That's what the African Union is trying to do. The Southern Cone of Latin America is doing, ECOWAS, etc. So we need to legalize, regulate, and tax mobility like we do all other governance sectors. And the key condition for that is to allow migrants to express themselves, and therefore we need to reduce their precarity. We need to regularize them, to take them out of the underground, have labor inspections, employer sanctions, apply labor law. And this will have a consequence on many other things. It will reduce pressure on refugee determination systems. In the 50s and 60s, many people who could have claimed protection never claimed protection. They could get a work permit within 48 hours. Why claim protection? Refugee protection. And it would reduce also the power of criminal networks. Since we have needs that call for migrants and we're not providing methods for their mobility, well, others are taking that place. We are responsible for subsidizing these criminal networks. And it would also enhance the capacity of border control. Most people in the 50s and 60s showed papers at all borders because there was no freedom of movement in the EU, for example. At that time, you had to show papers, and they did. And it was not difficult. And the countries knew who was there and who wasn't. Now, in the end, that's my conclusion. We need to replace this prohibitionist zero tolerance policy by a harm reduction policy. We did that for alcohol. We're doing it now for drugs. It is working. We need to change this mindset that we have that a war on migrants is, will succeed, where a war on drugs and a war on alcohol in the 20s and 30s, or a war on terror is not. And it's the opposite of what most host countries are doing. And I don't see them doing anything different in the coming 10 to 15 years. And that's, to me, my sadness, if you want. I won't be there really to see that blooming. The Global Compact is a first step. It gives us a framework for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. International cooperation will be essential. We cannot go it alone. No country can go it alone and open borders, or progressively open borders, all by itself. So we need to create common approaches at regional level. We need to do that for labor needs, but also for emergency response in order to avoid imbalances and crisis. And in the end, to me, and I conclude with that sentence, like for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we have developed over decades, we need to create a culture of human security for all migrants and refugees in our host societies, which it hasn't been done yet. And the Global Compact may be the starting point of that. I certainly hope that a future generation will pick it up and implement it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francois. I let you run over because you're so interesting and you're so passionate about the subject that it's always a pleasure to listen to you and to hear how you've been developing your thinking. Thank you so much for the big overview, how we need to look at this from a long-term perspective, not as if we're just responding to the latest development in Afghanistan. We have a number of questions, I think, that have already come up for various different members of the panel. And my fellow presenter, Mari, is going to read out the questions to us, and we'll direct them to each of you, depending on what the focus is. Mari, what have we got in the Q&A box?
We have one question to Francois at first here. It's from Anna Trendefalo. Francois, yes, we need preparedness, but notoriously migration forecasts get it wrong. In addition, comparing migration with floods and extreme weather conditions presents the risk of suggesting that migration or asylum seeking is a disaster that falls upon us and we need to neutralize it. We lose sight of all the positive aspects of migration, the agency of migrants and their contributions, etc. So I guess it's a more of a comment than a question, but feel free to comment back.
I totally agree with Anna. I mean, we know each other, and I'm saying preparedness because this is what we do when we do long-term planning on everything. We do long-term planning, even us individuals, we do long-term planning. We buy houses and we take mortgages for 25 years. This is how we create positive outcomes for ourselves, not simply having our nose stuck to the immediate time. So I'm not comparing with floods, etc., but we do this emergency preparedness in many fields. We do emergency preparedness now with the pandemic. We do that. And that means that if there is a need for quick mobilization of resources, we have prepared, we have a reserve, we have a way of doing it. We have a critical path on how to develop, how to mobilize these resources in a very quick fashion. I mean, UNHCR is the champion of emergency preparedness and quick mobilization of resources to answer. You know, let's imagine that the EU in 2012 had offered 100,000 places for Syrian refugees who were in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And in 2013, 200. And in 2014, 300, because they have developed the capacity and worked with civil society and international organization in order to create that and provide papers to people who need to go with the, you know, collaboration of IOM and UNHCR. You know, we might have had a 2015 crisis, but it would have been very different. This is what I call emergency preparedness. We know that people are going to come. We know we have a crisis. Everything we see from the past few weeks from European leaders, and that's true of North American leaders. Canada offered, I think, 20,000 places. I would have liked Canada to say, we are going to offer 20,000 places in 2021. We're going to offer 30,000 places in 2022, 40,000 places in 2023, and so on. And we have a 5-year program in order to welcome people who are, you know, identified by UNHCR, IOM, other organizations as in need of protection. But this is what we're most missing on migration. Migration policies are reactive, you know, on the immediate issue, and we get often horrible results. We need to plan. We need to know that there will be more people coming. We need to understand collectively that we need these people to come to respond to labor needs, to create wealth in our societies. And when I say wealth, I mean cultural wealth and material wealth. These are things that need to be discussed, and problematically in our countries, in many host countries, it cannot be discussed because of it's been hijacked, and the complicity of the center doesn't help. Sorry, I can talk for hours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over the baton to Madeleine, but I'd just like to say, I asked my students at the beginning of the semester whether they want to live in a world which is very homogeneous or one with diversity. And 100% said they wanted to live in a world with diversity, that they like diversity, and that they left their hometown because they were sick of homogeneity. Madeleine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Elspeth, and thank you, Francois, for allowing me to jump on your question, if I may, just to add to it, because I think Anna has really touched upon a really important issue. As regards the analogy with disasters, I think there is a relevant element there, because UNHCR is doing a lot of work at international level around the question of mobility linked to the effects of climate change and disaster. And there, I think we see very clearly, particularly in regions of the world that are most vulnerable to the risks associated with climate change, a pressing need to build the resilience of communities and to take steps to mitigate risks associated with that, so that people in those regions will not be forced to flee, but might be able to move and adapt to challenges linked to impacts on their livelihoods and other things, so that they don't have to flee. And that there are, for example, extensive discussions around ideas linked to planned relocation in some Pacific islands of the world. Fiji has a national framework for planned relocation to address address Indigenous communities who are at risk from sea level rise and others. So certainly in that regard, there is some important planning that does need to be done in that regard, linked to real natural hazards, disasters, and climate change. But moving to the question of planning and preparedness more broadly for arrivals, I agree with Francois. This is something that we can and need to do, but not in a way that can feed into rhetoric around scaremongering or to create a sense of panic. On the contrary, what message needs to be sent here is that arrivals can be managed and can be dealt with in a way that means that their negative impact on both host communities and on individuals themselves can be minimized. I think one of the unfortunate elements that we see emerging in political, anti-migrant political discourse is a sense that these are indeed, as you said on your slide, Francois, floods of people that are coming that will overwhelm us. This doesn't have to be the case. We know that there are resources in Europe and elsewhere that can be put in place that can ensure that people can be managed, and people's arrivals can be managed in ways that guarantee effective conditions and can ensure that they are effectively documented and that this is potentially something that's eminently handleable. We unfortunately haven't seen enough of that in recent years. We still today in Greece see deplorable conditions for people who have arrived in many cases some time ago. In the Balkans, we also see similarly, in some cases, unfortunately, deliberate efforts to limit work around creating reception capacity and other things. And these are things that can be tackled. And this is certainly a part of what the Global Compact on Refugees has called for, enhancement of capacity for reception and admission, as well as the whole rationale of the Migration Compact, which calls for orderly migration. So I would agree this really has to be an important part of discussions with states and highlighted as something that is also in their best interests. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that contribution, Madeleine. I think it's particularly important. I was speaking this morning to a journalist in Poland who was saying that a generation of young lawyers are now at the borders between Poland and the neighboring states. And as soon as they see someone who needs assistance, they rush over and they say, "Are you seeking asylum?" before the border guards can beat them up and push them back across the border. And she was very depressed. And I said to her, "You are heroes. 20 years ago in Poland, no one was calling me up asking me what the Geneva Convention means. And here you are, as part of a new generation who are struggling as part of civil society." But Murray, tell us what the other questions are now in the Q&A.
We have a lot of questions in the Q&A and we might not get through them all before the break, but there is a question for Madeleine from Craig Damien from the Cirque Migration at Ryerson. And it reads, my presentation this afternoon examines the CRRF MERPs in Central America and frames its implementation in light of decades of US-led efforts at containing mixed migration from and through the region. Can you comment on the critique that the GCR's focus on local solutions, integration, development aid, and asylum capacity building are, in effect, a recognition of the decline of durable solution and in effect a part of a focus on containment? So that was for Madeleine. So you can take the floor.
Thank you very much, Murray, and thank you, Craig, for this really important question. I would agree on the one hand that indeed we have not got sufficient engagement and sufficient progress on durable solutions, and we need more engagement there. But this has to, as a crucial element, include also work around local integration and increasing capacity of all states to receive and to create long-term conditions for refugees to stay, not merely those in the global north. The three traditional durable solutions that are expressed in UNHCR's statute talk about resettlement, about voluntary return, and local integration. And the third one in particular has been traditionally very sensitive in many parts of the world, but it has to be something that we are seeking to pursue, and it's something which we do need to seek to create the conditions for. What is not acceptable indeed is to promote this to the exclusion of access to solutions and access in third countries, including the global north. This can't be something that is done exclusively with a containment objective, but as a broad approach towards creating more solutions for the many refugees worldwide who are who need them, and as a matter of urgency, not in the longer term. It's important for us to work also on countries in the global south with nascent asylum regimes and with goodwill to try and create opportunities for refugees to be able to stay, to support them in seeking to do this. So, as I said, it's crucial that this can't be predicated on a logic of containment and or externalization, which is also, unfortunately, a policy shift that we see in some states. But broadly speaking, seeking to encourage, scope, and create conditions for local integration has to be as important as seeking to also create more scope for people to return voluntarily to their countries of origin in conditions where conditions permit that in safety and dignity, as well as third country solutions through resettlement and complementary pathways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. Mari, do we have time for one last question?
We can take one last from Anna, and that's a question for Catherine. There's talk in Europe in the media. Are we going to face another exodus? What will happen with Afghanistan? And politicians are urged to reassure citizens. And I'm not sure if that question may have been broken up, but there is definitely a few questions in there that you could answer, Catherine.
Thank you. And I've seen all the very interesting questions there, the elements of the question from Anna. So let me come into this. I think this is obviously a thing that we're dealing with constantly at the moment in Europe, is the EU's response and Europe's response to the events in Afghanistan. I would judge the EU response to have been mixed, and we could also say more widely across Europe. On the one hand, we have seen a very self-serving use of the spectre of 2015 and the unnecessary crisis of that time, the use of that image and that idea to justify already planned restrictive measures. So that goes from Commissioner Skinas saying this is why we need the pact. We would say this is exactly why the pact is not the answer, to the interior ministers standing up, using this rhetoric, calling for instance, for deportation to continue just days before Kabul fell, and arguing now for an approach based on the prevention of the arrival of supposedly this mass of people. That is I call this self-serving because I don't see any even trying to be fair, I don't see any justification for seeing for presenting this idea. It is really just a way to create fear in the general public, to justify harsher measures, and it certainly creates immense insecurity for Afghans. We know that the numbers arriving will not be similar to the situation in 2015, 2016, just because of, for various reasons, but I won't say it's because of what's happened since, because it's not entirely true. We're seeing this countered by more sensible approaches, particularly from the foreign policy side and from in the EU institutions, from the External Action Service and from the European Parliament, where there's a more balanced approach. And I think as civil society, we've just issued a statement that was published 2 days ago with our arguments as to what should be our recommendations for the EU's response. And the first three main recommendations are in the field of external affairs and international relations. And it's about supporting the evacuation and then establishing safe and legal routes for the next phase when the airport closes. It's for humanitarian assistance to the countries, to independent actors in Afghanistan, which the EU does well through its money, but through the functioning of ECHO. And it's for re-establishment of security for the Afghan people, i.e. the human security that's needed. And And then after that, we refer to what should be done in Europe. So one of the things we're trying to argue for is that the response should be in the hands of the international relations and foreign policy experts, not in the hands of interior ministers, because this is an international and global situation. And I think it comes back to the point that was mentioned in relation to some of the findings and this institutional architecture of asylum in Europe, where we've seen this increasing dominance of interior ministries that have but one agenda, which is to limit the arrivals of people in Europe. And in all circumstances, our efforts are to have other policy actors, other ministries, other constituents balancing out their influence. That said, let me wrap up with just a few points on that links that question with the question of crisis. We're also making recommendations about the need for access to asylum in Europe for the small proportion of those displaced who do arrive. And here we're in firm defense of Article 31, access, APD access requirements, court judgments, everything to do with ensuring that there is access to asylum for those who arrive through their own means, which remains one of the, as I mentioned in my earlier comments, the key priority in Europe in many senses. And so any use of safe and legal channels is not a justification for not offering that protection. And here we're arguing that there is a lot that can be done in terms of preparations. And those preparations should, in a sense, not be necessary because asylum systems should be functioning. But given that there are weaknesses, put the resources in now so that those arriving have rapid access to fair procedures. And where necessary, invoke the crisis measures, such as the Temporary Protection Directive. That is an ongoing debate. There are pros and cons to it. I understand the dilemma, which I think was also raised by Anna in response to Francois's presentation. Using the terminology and the framing of crisis is risky because this is then used to justify the use of emergency measures and frequently to justify, which are undemocratic frequently and not to be applied to asylum situations, but also used to justify all the restrictive policies that we know about. 2015, 2016 was a manageable situation. It became a political crisis. We see a similar thing. The risk is that a similar thing happens, not the risk of people arriving, but the risk of political paralysis and exploitation by extremist forces. Nonetheless, sometimes you can't avoid using crisis as a term. It is also useful. It allows for operational preparations. So what we're now saying as a compromise is prevention of crisis mechanisms, prevention of crisis. So in the debate on the reform of EU asylum law, there is a proposed crisis regulation, and we're putting forward our alternatives, which are based on prevention of crisis mechanisms, to try to avoid that a situation becomes a crisis. And with the Afghan situation, I think having in place those measures already would be a way to avoid the crisis. And there is also a relationship to what's happening in relation to the Belarus situation, where we have also been trying to say this is not a crisis, it's a manageable situation, just because the legislative changes being proposed and rushed through by the affected countries are based on there being a state of emergency, when again it is manageable. And the EU rapidly deploying in Lithuania, for instance, I think is a sign of something that can be a positive response to a challenging situation. I will wrap up by saying, coming back to Anna's original point, I think this is a sort of perpetual struggle between different elements and different policymakers and different constituencies in terms of how to present and talk about a situation such as Afghanistan. And while on the one hand, we see draft conclusions from the Slovenian presidency, which represent a far-right agenda trying to get into EU decision-making in the Council, JHA Council meeting on Tuesday. See our Twitter for more information on that. On the other hand, we hear the words of, for instance, High Representative Borrell, which talk about the need to understand this as a displacement crisis, as a refugee situation, and not even refer to people leaving Afghanistan as migrants.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We've run horribly over time and the organizers are about to beat me up for this, but this has been such an interesting discussion. Thank you so much to all three of you for your insights, your thoughts, your engagement with the PROTECT project, and your ambition to improve refugee protection around the world. Thank you so much. Murray, I'll hand over to you to tell everybody when they have to be back for the next session.
We start back here at past. So wherever you are in the world, I guess that applies. And you can continue the discussion on Padlet. I've pasted the link to our online discussion room. So if you want to post any more questions to our Policy Forum panelists, you can do that there. And same goes for the panelists. You can also answer the questions there. And I'll paste the link again in the chat. So I'll see you all back at 30 past. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we can get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this academic forum of our midterm conference. Before I introduce our three distinguished speakers, I would like to take a moment to pay tribute to Francisco Rico Martinez, who passed away recently. And so Francisco was a pillar of our community of refugee advocates and migrant protection here in Toronto and in Canada in general. He was the co-director of the FCJ Refugee Center in Toronto, and he was a great supporter of researchers and academics. Last year, Yona and I had the opportunity of meeting him and discussing with him our PROTECT research project. He was very helpful. And Francisco's funeral was held or is being held today, this morning. So I wanted to take this opportunity to give a thought of gratitude to Francisco Rico Martinez to start this panel. So welcome to our three distinguished speakers. We have today on this panel three very accomplished researchers and very influential academics in the field of migration, forced migration, human rights. Our first speaker is Sergio Carrera. He is a senior research fellow and head of Home Affairs Unit at CEPS. CEPS is a leading think tank and a forum for debate on European Union affairs. Sergio is also the PI of Asylum project, which is a sister project of our PROTECT research project. Sergio is a professor at the Migration Policy Center in the European University in Florence, in Italy. He's a visiting professor at the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po, France. He's also an associate professor and senior research fellow at the Faculty of Law in Maastricht University. His publications are very well known to those who are interested in forced migration, human rights, and also on common European asylum system and the recent pact of the European Union. And I found them personally extremely illuminating for my teaching and understanding of these very complicated asylum systems and the new pact as well. Our second speaker is Anna Triandafilidou. We are extremely fortunate at Ryerson to have her as the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration. Anna is also a national expert, very well-known expert globally. She serves as an expert, for instance, in the OECD network of international migration experts, and she acts as an evaluator of research projects for the European Research Council and several national ministries, research agencies, and universities across the globe. She has also worked as an evaluator for DG Home Policies on migrant integration for the European Union and has been a consultant for the European Parliament on high-scale migration policy reform. Anna's long list of publications and other research contributions reflect, of course, the diversity and complexity of these areas, and she greatly and scientifically contributes to these areas by her publications and presentations. Our third speaker today is Jennifer Heinemann. Jennifer is a professor in the Faculty of Environmental Urban Change. She is also an associate vice president, Research and Innovation at York University, Toronto. Jennifer is a past director of the Center for Refugee Studies at York University, which is an extremely well-known and highly regarded research center in Toronto, but also globally. Professor Heinemann's research focuses on several issues, including conflict, human displacement, and the geopolitics of humanitarian response and refugee protection. She has extensively published also on refugee resettlement. She is one of the leading experts on Canada's refugee resettlement scheme. She also published on how private refugee sponsorship is sustained over time in Canadian communities. As you may know, these are very topical issues, and we have now extensive discussion about the Afghan refugee situation and Canada's commitment to resettle refugees from Afghanistan. I would like to now give the floor to Sergio. I would like to say welcome to our speakers again. And I'm looking forward to your presentations and to the Q&A that will follow your presentations. Sergio, over to you.
Thank you so much, Idil, for your very kind words of introduction and for the invitation to the PROTECT project, to this excellent conference. Of course, I join in this thought of gratitude towards Francisco, and it's an honor to be able to participate in this conversation. Also coming from the perspective of this sister project, you mentioned, Idil, to protect, the Asylum project that I coordinate, a Horizon 2020 project, looking at the European Union's role in implementing the Global Compact on refugees. And through the first year and a half of this project, we've paid attention to different priorities, amongst them the so-called Pact on Migration and Asylum that has been mentioned during the conference, and also the policy brief of PROTECT, a few references there. The question I will try to explore in my presentation is the extent to which the Pact is really implementing the Global Compact on refugees. And I will explore that question in a number of steps. First, by raising the question, what is this Pact about? Whose Pact is this? Second, identifying the priorities and foundations of the Pact. Next, also how do these priorities and foundations are operationalized into legislative proposals. And of course, you could expect from me to identify the challenges of these legislative proposals from a number of perspectives, not least fundamental rights, but also coherency and solidarity. And then hopefully this will inform the question that I was given in preparation to this panel, as to the extent to which we can expect the Global Compact on refugees to positively inform the European Union approach in asylum governance. So let's start. What is this EU Pact about? Well, first of all, the European Commission has been in the driving seat since 2019, holding a number of bilateral meetings with ministries of interior across member states. So since the beginning, the Commission has approached this exercise as a consensus-building strategy, giving early concessions and compromises to certain member states' home affairs ministries, and finding inspiration on some policies, currently existing policies in Europe, that I think they need to inform the way in which at least the Asylum project is approaching our examination of the role of the European Union in implementing the GCR. We are seeing the proliferation of pre-entry screening procedures and accelerated border procedures in some EU member states. The priority here is containment, very clearly, and reluctance to accept refugees, both spontaneous arrivals and through resettlement. This is manifesting in a number of well-evidenced illegal pushbacks at EU external borders, but also cases of violence, very clear examples of violence against people, arbitrary detention, and the criminalization of refugees. Now, so instead of enforcing existing EU asylum and border law standards, the European Commission has strategically chosen to convert these existing policies in countries like Hungary, but this is just one example, convert them into EU policy priorities, and therefore indirectly legitimize their objectives and, in my view, questionable use across the EU. We see now examples in Lithuania and Poland trying to replicate similar approaches. What's the result of this? Why is this important? Because by doing so, the European Commission and the Pact on Migration and Asylum are reversing Europeanization in these domains. They are re-injecting intergovernmentalism in policy domains that, let's remind ourselves, are already a long way in terms of Europeanization. We have a quite solid legal framework of standards that fall squarely in EU competence and scrutiny. And by giving so much emphasis, so much importance to the European Council and to ministries of interior, and also calling for a consensus, meaning de facto unanimity amongst all EU member states, in areas where at the moment in the treaties, in the Lisbon Treaty, they are subject to qualified majority voting, and where the European Parliament is co-legislature and is playing a crucial role in democratic accountability, sidelining the European Parliament is very detrimental when upholding the current state of Europeanization. Also, the terminology of the pact is misleading because we think of a pact like there is an agreement, right? Well, if anything we've learned during the last year, this pact was presented in September 2020, with almost 1 year since the adoption of the pact, is that member states continue to disagree fundamentally on the main proposals put forward by the pact, not least on how to distribute responsibility and how to couple that model of distribution with new ideas concerning asylum and borders. So my view is that the pact is in fact not a pact at all. This is what we have conveyed in the Asylum.project publications. Now, what are the pact's assumptions and priorities? And this also relates to PROTECT research. First, the pact pursues a so-called integrated approach between asylum, migration enforcement, and border management. By doing so, it blurs international protection and distinctive legal areas that are, for very good reason, different in objectives, purposes, and effects. This leads to the over-focus, a disproportionate focus on returns and expulsions. It has been mentioned in previous panels. And how is this justified by the European Commission? Well, it's justified on what I would call partial, questionable, perhaps false reading of official statistics by Eurostat. The assumption is that a majority of people that arrive in the EU are not real refugees and beneficiaries of international protection. Why is this a partial reading? Well, when the Commission only uses first recognition rates, positive recognition rates during 2019, which indeed have been around 30%, but it does not take into account also all the people who have received positive decisions as beneficiaries of protection for humanitarian reasons. This increases the figure to 40%. neither those who have successfully challenged in appeal first negative decisions, which in fact have been quite many, more than 91,000 people successfully challenged. Of course, I'm always hesitant to build my arguments purely on statistics. So the Commission also completely disregards the qualitative reality of how difficult it is for people to have access to justice, effective justice. This has been not only pointed out by the International Commission of Jurists and ECRE's work, but also by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Migrants. The second priority of the pact, which is also interesting when looking at the Global Compact on refugees, is the idea of that it pursues a sort of asymmetric interstate solidarity. Now, solidarity is a notion that is inherently contested. It serves many purposes, including in the Common European Asylum System. But the EU has been quite consistent in pursuing an understanding of solidarity which is interstate, is a state-centric understanding of solidarity. And here the pact provides us with this idea of very interesting idea. I'm still trying to figure mandatory flexible solidarity, which to my understanding is a contradiction in terms, but here we are, providing member states the voluntary possibility to pick and choose on how do they contribute towards fairly responsive, fairly sharing responsibility on asylum seekers, and even to opt out from the right to seek asylum, which is now legally binding in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. Solidarity, this solidarity, of course, is completely detached from individuals at the moment in the European Union, and it gives the wrong idea that states can flexibly choose whether to comply or not with their obligations under international refugee and human rights law, which I find very problematic. Now, based on these assumptions, the pact comes with a package of legislative proposals were mentioned before by ECRE, by Catherine. I will limit my comments into the ones that I think are more interesting for today's discussion. Overall, they aim at speed, managerialism, a migration management approach to all these matters, and deterritorialization. If you look, for example, at mandatory pre-entry screening, it creates this legal fiction of non-entry. These individuals, for the purposes of identification, also gathering biometrics, and even as PROTECT is also focusing COVID-19 health considerations, are considered as not having entered the territory of the member state. This is what the pact proposes. This is linked also with mandatory border procedures, which means fitting in speed, accelerated logic of assessing asylum applications, and obliging member states to apply this fast procedure when individuals have a positive recognition rate below 20%. So it's just this statistical figure, which has nothing to do with qualitative assessment. This is then linked with the new Dublin regulation, which is called Asylum and Migration Regulation. This brings me back to the critique before. This hybridization between asylum and migration enforcement is in the very title of this regulation. Also in the new Asylum Procedures Regulation, mixing up asylum and return procedures. And there is what I said before, a pick and choose approach for member states to choose between participating in relocation, a new idea called return sponsorship, which is, in my view, extremely problematic, allowing member states to enter in diplomatic talks with third countries to ease returns and readmission of people, but also through capacity building and operational support. So member states can pick and choose amongst these options. And the last legislative proposal is one on crisis and force majeure. You know that in EU politics, they love crisis. Crisis is co-productive. It opens up opportunities for pursuing old ideas and trying to sell them in a fast way as absolutely necessary. Now, the problem with this is that this proposal on crisis widens even up further procedural exceptions and derogations. in respect of the pre-screening and border procedures proposals. It extends deadlines for people to be kept, being deprived of moving, and it also envisages two crisis-led procedures. The possibility to assess even on the merits an asylum application in a border procedure is also envisaged there for people with 75% or lower average rate, which is an enormously high percentage as well. And also in the field of returns, expanding the grounds upon which it can be presumed that the person risks absconding, and therefore it may justify expulsion. Now, what are the main challenges with these proposals? The first one is this hybridization, this integrated approach. I think it runs contrary not only to the European Union treaties and secondary legislation, but it also poses grave concerns when read in light of national, legal and administrative landscape in the EU and also the Global Compact on Refugees. Because asylum, migration enforcement, and border surveillance and control are clearly distinct and separate domains, legal fields. This is, if we all read the EU treaties, we have 3 different legal bases for each of these topics, with different objectives, upon which secondary legislation has been adopted. So we have the Schengen Borders Code, the Returns Directive, the current Dublin Regulation. They all have very specific legal bases that bring them back to the domain they serve. And they have also very specific operational conditions and notions that serve very specific purposes, like irregular border crossing doesn't serve the same purpose in the Dublin Regulation than in the Returns Directive. But also, if we look at the composite field of national authorities with direct or indirect competences under each of these domains, the pact hybridization is completely crazy and legally incoherent. In our research, and I know that this has been also a point of PROTECT that I think is, a point we share of concern. In our research, we've seen how more than half of the EU member states count with a professionalized or designated asylum authority that is independent from the ministries of the interior and from the authorities which are responsible for return decisions and enforcing removal orders, and also those who perform border control and border surveillance. By taking this hybrid approach, the pact prioritizes the law enforcement and policing folks over the asylum professionals. And why is this also a problem? Well, this interferes with the independence and impartiality of asylum authorities. We learned this throughout the political pressures that the Greek Asylum Appeal Authority was exposed since the entry into force of the EU-Turkey statement, or what I call also has been called the EU-Turkey deal, informal arrangement or deal, an enormous amount of pressure, directly undermining the independence of the asylum authorities to do their job. So I think this is the PROTECT recommendation to pay particular attention to the independence that these separate bodies remain independent from state structures is absolutely crucial. Now, when it comes to fundamental rights, this legal fiction of non-entry is also in both the pre-entry screening and the asylum procedures is also quite problematic. I mean, so the assumption is that people are not in the territory while they are de facto controlled by the state authorities or under the responsibility of the state authorities. Of course, this leads, the pact nurtures, together with the Strasbourg Court jurisprudence, which in my view is very unfortunate in this field. It nurtures legal ambiguity and uncertainty about why, what does it matter? Why does it matter to have a legal fiction of non-entry? Now, in our interviews with the European Commission, we didn't find a common line or even consensus as to whether the pact actually promotes or calls member states to use detention. Commissioner Johansson said in the European Parliament briefing or presentation of the pact in the Libe Committee, no, the pact is not proposing detention. Well, when one reads the specific legislative proposals, it is very difficult to understand how member states would fulfill what the pre-entry screening and the border procedures proposals prescribe without actually de facto detaining people. So leaving this legal ambiguity, the pact is actually indirectly fostering and promoting and legitimizing very fundamental rights sensitive approach. This of course goes in line with less procedural safeguards, less justice, effective access to appeal and justice for people, which runs contrary to basic rule of law principle of the EU, where everybody has access to the same justice standards. And this also negatively, this managerialism, which inspires the pact and many European Union member states current policies, fast, speed, business-like way of dealing with people's lives and dignity, undermines the fairness and quality of asylum procedures. Now, in that context, we then put the notion of crisis into the picture, and it becomes even more interesting, because what is crisis? What is, what is a mass influx? What are we talking about? The pact provides few definitions, which are completely subjective and legally uncertain and vague, subject to huge politicization and discretion by the Commission and the member states. So we better forget about giving way to the using these notions, and in the name of crisis, really undermining human dignity and the rule of law. It is true that perhaps when the pact was written by the European Commission, the Court of Justice in Luxembourg had not yet ruled against Hungary that people kept in the transit zone between Hungary and Serbia were indeed deprived of liberty and constituted detention for the purpose of EU law. So this is basically constituted, the Luxembourg court taking a different approach to the one held by the Strasbourg court in Ilias and Hamed judgments, which I think the Luxembourg court very much welcomed conclusion to say, yes, this is detention, this is an autonomous concept of EU law. So therefore, why do we need this legal fiction of non-entry now? It is very clear that whatever Hungary or any other state do in these so-called transit zones fall within the scope of EU law. Now, my last question, and I know I'm running out of time. Can the global compacts positively inform the implementation of the EU policies and the pact? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is exactly what I've done. Basically, it provides all of us with a reference point, a point of reference for accountability of whatever state or regional organization, the European Union, do or don't do in respect of asylum policies. I will not underestimate this central role of accountability and justification. Justification that policymakers need to justify their decisions and their actions. And I think yesterday I found very interesting Professor Hathaway's presentation. One can, of course, always, as a lawyer myself, aim at having legally binding standards, of course, but why is there a conflict with a global compact that provides a parallel framework for accountability, political accountability, public accountability, democratic accountability? I don't see a direct clash. If time may be for having a protocol or whatever we call it, or a legally binding commitment, I don't see such an antagonism. I think they can actually run perfectly together. And if anything, and this is also something that PROTECT highlights, and I will finish with this, the linking international refugee standards with human rights commitments, this principled approach of the Global Compact on refugees is absolutely crucial. when reading and scrutinizing, existing national policies or new proposals, such as the ones of the pact. I mean, I can mention, for instance, the key role, and in the Asylum project, we have already engaged on that. Our policy brief proposes to engage more actively regional parliaments, to have parliamentary diplomacy in keeping states' governments accountable to their political commitments. We're thinking of the African Union, the European Union, there are other regional parliaments. Why to underestimate the role that this may have? So I see that certainly my answer is yes, it positively informs the implementation, but also the scrutiny and accountability of these policies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sergio Carrera. I would like to give the floor now to Dr. Anna Triandafilidou.
Thank you, dear Idil. Thank you all for having me today and for the interesting discussions yesterday and this morning. Of course, we're all full of good ideas. I sometimes think, well, what would the government say if they heard us? Hopefully they do, at least our colleagues from the previous panels who are more involved in advocacy and in public consultations. Actually, I'm happy that neither Sergio nor Francois in the previous panel stole my thunder. So I believe we're nicely complementary. I did not prepare more like a structured talk, like a paper, but I tried to link some of my own critical observations of what is happening with the preliminary findings of the project. And I hope this can lead us to an interesting discussion in this panel too. So I want to first highlight in terms of our context and the context of the research of the PROTECT project, so that we need to keep in mind how migration is changing and has been changing in the last, in the last 60 years, but also particularly perhaps in the last 10 to 15 years. So first of all, I think we always need, and in a way in defense of our progressive ideas or in support of our progressive ideas towards those that are more skeptical, to highlight how the world has been changing after World War II, because where our legal instruments, the Geneva Convention, comes from the aftermath of that war. But we live today in a new context. So we live in a post-1989 context where I think many of us, well, not me actually, because I'm old enough, but those of us who are too young to remember those days, they forget that at the time asylum seekers were very much welcome. We lived in a different world because asylum seekers were the proof that the West and capitalism is the good system and communism and the East are the bad systems and liberal democracy is the good system and communism is bad. So I think that the wider geopolitical context needs to be taken into account. And then of course, particularly for North America, 9/11, which was felt differently. I think in Europe, maybe for Europe, a reckoning of international terrorism was more 2005 and then 2015 and 16. And I think we need also to keep in mind, and I want to, this I raise also a bit as a question for reflection for the project, because I realized the project was written before the pandemic and was approved before the pandemic. And I remember when Idil first invited me, we were planning for a real event, real meaning in person. So how do we integrate our lessons learned from the pandemic that is still ongoing in terms of how we deal with migration and asylum? So, but also keeping in mind the geopolitical context, not just 1989, even though I still think 1989 is crucial for the whole way in which we frame migration and asylum. But also the replacement of the G7 still exists, but we have a G20 that is also an equally important, even if European countries and certainly Canada like to think that the G7 is still so important. The fact that China is rising and India is rising and other countries like Brazil. So even now when we speak about Afghanistan, we're asking what Russia or China are doing, not just the US. NATO has seen its role completely redrawn. The EU has risen as an international global actor. and also with an increasingly, how can I say, vocal external action service. So what do we do of this? How do we link this new geopolitical context with our considerations of migration and asylum, and of how we deal with humanitarian crisis? And in relation to that, the fact that I think that asylum, so 20 years ago, Jennifer and I would be in two different areas of study, and we would meet for coffee, but we wouldn't think we had so much to say in terms of our common interests. And maybe you, Idil, also coming from a legal background, and Sergio. But I think in the last 10 to 15 years, our areas have converged. So political science, sociology, governance of migration, and governance of asylum and international law. And this is both a development in academia and research, but I think it's also a development of real life and what is happening. And I think the problem is, coming back to the work of the project and our general reflections, that this is not sufficiently recognized and embodied in the global compacts, and I believe also in the EU Pact. So I think this is one comment that I want to bring to you. So, and also more specifically about the pandemic, how do you think the pandemic will be, how can I say, reflected or involved in your work going forward, or have you already seen it involved? Because I think also the pandemic has posed two things that I think have been partly referenced yesterday and today, which one is the essential migrant workers and what is essential and who is essential, and more of a recognition that migration is essential to the functioning of society and the economy, and that when we live in a world dominated by global value chains, we cannot live in our small hometown, close in our territorial borders, and actually that we had to charter flights to bring people in, while at the same time we were elevating citizenship and permanent residence as the highest thing, and we're trying to close our borders to leave the pandemic out, and in that sense leave refugees, asylum seekers out. And I think in a way it is enheartening that in the last few weeks and days, in particular with the discussion on Afghanistan, we didn't hear anything about, are these people bringing the virus? And so I think in a way I welcome this as a return of normality, that we're focusing on the humanitarian crisis and not on whether on the pandemic issues. But we know that even generous countries like Canada closed their borders to asylum seekers during particularly the acute phases of the pandemic. Just kind of taking this approach, I first need to think of my own. And then, really the asylum seekers were the least, in a concentric circle kind of, graph, they were the last circle. So this is one question and reflection. Second question is, where do the global compacts stand today? And again, I think when you wrote the project and you started your work, that was not, we lived in a different world. That was where migration was booming. And the question was, how can we manage it better? And I wonder whether the global compacts are still fit for purpose. And how will the governance of migration evolve? For instance, we have seen people who were previously participating in regulated migration schemes being forced to return with summary processing to the countries of origin, now being vaccinated, being given priority to be vaccinated, for instance, in southern India, in Kerala, so they can go back to Dubai and other places to work. And a lot of countries like Nepal, for instance, or Bangladesh being left to their own devices under the pandemic crisis. And one wonders, how do the global compacts deal with that? Because I'm afraid that while the compacts are a good development, and I will talk about it in a minute, they create this dichotomy between a good and a bad migration. So the good migration is safe, regular, and orderly, and the bad migration is the irregular, unsafe, disorderly. But we know that in the world, most migration, first of all, is mixed, so it is humanitarian too. And we usually, I believe, cannot really very clearly make black and white distinctions. And at the same time, it is unsafe and disorderly. So I'm afraid that by reinforcing this language of secure and controlled and regulated migration or asylum seeking, we are doing injustice, and we're living further, how can I say, in the shadows, all the people that try to move and that do not have clear legal channels waiting for them. And I think on this, I would like to both put this reflection forward and ask you how, if you're thinking of dealing with that in the project. So how do we recognize beyond, even now talking about Afghanistan, we talk about risk, but risk is something that you can calculate, something that you can make a probability and say the probability for X thousand of Afghans to come to Iran or try to come to Europe is X. But I think what Afghanistan, or if you want Haiti of a few weeks ago, show is that migration and humanitarian migration involves a lot of uncertainty. There can be no safe broadcast, and this is also my reflection in response to Francois and the discussion we had in the previous panel, is that we need to recognize that there is a lot of uncertainty, that forecasts. So of course, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to plan ahead to help people, but that there can be no silver bullet, no one-size-fits-all solution, and that we need to work with different channels, and that politicians need to tell people there's no one way that you can regulate migration like you regulate traffic, and that migration involves a lot of uncertainty and at the same time a lot of dynamism, a lot of resilience, a lot of creative and productive power. But we need to acknowledge that governments, it's not a failure of governments, it's just the nature of things, that migration will happen through many channels, and what we should do is try to manage this as best we can, also listening to people on the ground, privileging regional and local solutions, including the non-state actors actively, in a way, perhaps privileging irrational solutions over the rational ones, to really make, to really face the complexity of the situations on the ground. And I think, for instance, the Afghan crisis, unfortunately, I say unfortunately that it is happening for the Afghan people, but we'll test again our paradigm of this. We can regulate things. And even, for instance, I can see it coming, and we've had this discussion in the last few days in Canada, for instance, you bring the interpreters and you bring their immediate family members, spouses and children, although there were delays in those too. Do you bring their siblings and their families? Do you bring the grandparents? Do you bring their other close family, like kinship, who might be targeted by the Taliban? How do you deal with these fuzzy lines? So, and then I move on to my third reflection or set of comments, which is, what are the good things that come out of the global compacts? And to ask, I mean, I think we heard some very interesting things yesterday, and probably we'll hear in the panels later today. But I do think that the compacts do help pluralize migration and asylum governance. They create those institutional structures for more actors to become part of those. And I was wondering whether we see also, given the pandemic, that there would be more regional cooperation and consultations coming, and how this can help, how can I say, further implement, the right to protect. Because I have in mind some very interesting studies documenting, for instance, how African countries came together in the period, before the global compacts were signed, to defend their own positions and, their own interests, or how civil society got together and is still probably getting together during these first 4 years of consultations within the UN network and getting its act together. So this is something very positive that I see in the compacts, and also what was discussed yesterday in this conference about creating a positive normative or political, if you want, environment that can drive possibly domestic, bilateral, or regional policymaking and cooperation. So maybe we were mentioning yesterday that sometimes the binding tools like some of the international legal conventions have had a hard time taking off, but the compacts could have much more of an indirect impact. And my last comment is, and it reflects also a question that was raised in the previous panel, but there was no time to answer it. Are all crises the same, or are some crises more important than others for the West? And I say the West to mean North America and Europe. And the colleague that was asking it was saying, what about the Tigray region in Ethiopia in relation to Afghanistan? I think my answer to that is that Americans and Canadians and Europeans feel that Afghanistan is partly a crisis of their own making, while they feel Ethiopia is not a crisis of their own making, or the Tigray region. Now, of course, maybe we need to delve deeper into what has brought to the Tigray region, because what is internal and external in a post-colonial context. But I think that this is one element. However, having said that, when we're looking at the impact of the compacts in different sets of countries and world regions, what comes to my mind, and I want to contribute to the discussion, is that we need to do away with the distinction between origin and destination countries, because I think all countries are, or nearly all, they're both origin and destination, and they're sometimes also transit countries. Think of the US. I think it's a destination country for sure. It's been a transit country typically for Canada. So for people coming to Canada through the US, and there's many US citizens, for instance, living in Europe and elsewhere in the world. So it's also an origin country. And this holds for all the countries. So, however, I want to give two examples. For instance, if we take Italy on one hand and Nigeria on the other, they're both involved in immigration, and transit migration, but their position in the geopolitical context is different. So, for instance, Italy sees a lot of its highly skilled people seeking, a better professional situation abroad, or even some of its lower skilled people seeking chances abroad. It sees transit migration, for instance, Eritreans going to Italy and then seeking to go further north or west in Europe. And it sees, of course, significant immigration, whether from Eurasia and Eastern Europe, or from East and West Africa, for instance, or also the Philippines and China. Nigeria, we tend to think, particularly in Europe or also in Canada, as an origin country. Lower or highly skilled Nigerians try to come to Europe and Canada, and we tend to forget that Nigeria is a very important destination country within West Africa, and actually that intra-regional migration in West Africa is 80% or more of all migration. So the part of migration that we see out of West Africa is a tiny fraction of what happens in the region. And Nigeria is also a transit country, as some people go through Nigeria to go further north, for instance, to Morocco or Europe. So what is the difference between the two? The difference is that Italy seems to belong to the first world, and Nigeria seems to belong to the third world, whatever these two connotations mean. And Italy is part of the G7 and Nigeria is not, although Nigeria is likely to become the third most populous country in the world in the decades to come, and is an economic powerhouse. So I think when discussing the impact of the global compacts, yes, I'm done. We need to also think of what are the different power hierarchies among the countries and how the compacts deal with that. And with this, I think I'll try to finish and leave the floor to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Anna. I'm sorry, but thanks for your very rich presentation. I would like to give the floor now to Dr. Jennifer Heinemann. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you, Adil, and thanks everyone. It's been a pleasure to be here for part of yesterday and today. And I just wanted to piggyback on something Anna said, which I think is so vital and fundamental for as a takeaway, which is the separation of migrants, if you like, people on the move into these two separate compacts and trying to refuse what might be called the false binary. I'm fond of quoting just very briefly the Betts and Collier description of these two categories. Migrants, quote, migrants are lured by hope, refugees are fleeing fear. Migrants hope for honeypots, refugees need havens, end of quote. And I think it's very important to realize the same person could be both migrant and refugee. And to Francois's point in the last presentation, regularization for people on the move so that they don't become illegal. And the non-entree that Sergio and others have mentioned does not become, non-entree policies don't become the rule in terms of managing migration. So I want to really just make two brief points coming at the end of very rich presentations. There's not too much I have to add, but my first point is that, echoing others, that the GCR, the Global Compact on Refugees, is more about improving the status quo than any major expansion of protection space. I'll say why and offer a global, not a European perspective. I would be ill-advised to do so among the expertise on the call, but also a subaltern perspective on the Global Compact, very briefly. And I'm going to build on a paper that I wrote last year in Refuge, open access paper with Joanna Reynolds. But really, the second point that I want to make is, can we better harness and translate some existing practices that may be fairly local, fairly contextual, specific to faith or specific to place, that we could perhaps use to enhance what has been called self-authorized security for migrants and refugees. And the notion of self-authorization really gets to the point of making sure that we check in and know that this is for and what people on the move want. And of course, they're making decisions for themselves, but just to underline that point. So to the first point, in 2018, I organized a workshop in Toronto, which of course, not nearly enough people could be invited to, but to have this conversation about what can the compacts accomplish and what do we need to do, where they cannot do enough, let's just say. So obviously the questions were big, and I applaud PROTECT for doing so much work. I actually got to watch a couple of the videos, and I want to just refer to the one by Elspeth Gild and Jürgen Bast, that in fact, maybe as many of us, refugee scholars, people looking at protection for migrants, maybe a number of the clues to what we can do in addition to the law might be found in the Global Compact for migration, not the compact for on refugees, so to speak. So on the one hand, I agree with Jim Hathaway yesterday that the GCR doesn't go far enough, but I part ways in having that faith, I think I would call it, in the convention. And I would argue that the Global Convention on Refugees is simply too convention centric. And that is to say, many countries who host many refugees are outside that legal framework. And then beyond that, many states that are signatories are ducking those international obligations. So I have grounds, I think, to be a bit skeptical about the convention. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to get rid of it. It's what we've got, and it's legally the best we have at the moment, along with the protocol. But I just, to Elspeth's point yesterday, she talked about the principle of non-regression in law. And I worry I think we might need to look at the practice of non-regression by states, and many people, including Sergio and so many others, have noted this. So we think of the Rohingya in Bangladesh, Syrians in Jordan and Lebanon, not to mention Turkey, which of course, if you're not a European refugee, you're not protected. So large swaths of people who've been in conditions of extended exile for many years are left out of a convention-centric compact. So that's maybe a self-evident point, but one that I wanted to underscore. Second point, what can we do, and trying to echo the more positive possibilities of the compact. I think some of the lesser known practices can come to the fore. Martin Jones, a lawyer who is working at the University of York, not at York University here in Toronto, asked the question at this Toronto workshop that I organized. He said, is the Global Compact on Refugees an example of legal Orientalism? Now, legal Orientalism comes out of Timur Ruskala's work on the notion of law in China being cast as and represented as the other, as inferior, primitive, not real law. And I think legal Orientalism is an interesting term in relation to the convention centrism of the Global Compact on Refugees. And I think, if we think about again, I'm just learning about the EU Pact, but if 85% or more of the world's refugees, and of course there are many who fall outside that category, who are for all intents and purposes, also people on the move under conditions not of their own making, is it enough to just work with the countries that are signatories to the convention? So that, again, the notion of legal Orientalism is one that's touched on in the paper. I also think if we have blinders on that keep us in the realm of international law in the conventional sense, pardon the pun, we miss out on things like adat, which I'll mention ever so briefly because I'm not an expert in it, but it's customary law used by the people of Aceh in relation to the Rohingya, where there was basically a kind of edict that you will help those of same faith and same region, really, who are in need of rescue and clothing, food, etc. And so the people of Aceh's response is very much, it's couched in customary law that is faith based, but is also quite local or regional. And I think we need to pay attention to some of those smaller practices. Could they be scaled up, or could we learn something from them that could be transferred into other places? So what other practices, I guess the question is, what other practices that exist might be captured, translated, and scaled up? Getting into those, I really don't have time. So let me end with one promising declaration. It's the Calcutta Declaration. So after meeting in Toronto in 2018, I was invited to go to Calcutta as part of the migration workshop put on by the Calcutta Research Group. And there, a declaration was forged, the Calcutta Declaration, which really acknowledged two things. One, that in South Asia, the GCR really didn't apply. If you're not a signatory, it just didn't seem relevant. And number two, what can be harnessed from the Global Compact on Migration that is important to take note of. And there were 8 points. Again, I'm happy to, I think you can Google the Calcutta Declaration and just find what those main points are, but I'm happy to share on the tablet page in a minute. But one of the 8 points that I want to underscore here is that refugees, migrants, stateless, and other displaced persons are central figures in any protection system, legal regime, government, and societal institution. So again, that subjectivity, that edict that we hear around Toronto and in so many parts of Europe as well, nothing about us without us, just a very deliberate way of centering the migrant refugee. And I say migrant refugee, asylum seeker with hyphens in between the names and a blurring of the categories, given the ways in which they can be used against migrants who may not qualify as refugees but are fearing for their lives. So as a final note to everybody, let's not lose a critical perspective on the compacts, despite a need and desire to apply them and improve protection and self-authorized security for refugees and all migrants. Thank you. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for your presentation. And I would like to thank again our three panelists. You explored, but also challenged Eurocentric or North America-centric approaches to the governance of migration, forced migration. Thank you for that. You gave us a lot of food for thought for the rest of our research project. Now I would like to open the floor. We have 16 minutes before the break for comments and questions. And so I will ask Yona Zufi, who is one of our conference organizers, to help me with the Q&A. Yona, I thank you in advance for that.
Of course, happy to do it. Yeah, so the Q&A function is open, so please feel free to write any questions or comments you have for the presenters and there in the chat. And I guess in the meantime, while we wait, if anyone has anything to add that you didn't get to quite cover during your presentation, please feel free to expand. So we have a question for Sergio from Francesca, and she asks, PROTECT is also researching on the external dimension of EU migration and asylum policy. Could it have, in your opinion, an impact on the capacity of EU to comply or to not comply with international requirements on international protection? And could the GCs have an impact on it?
Thank you. Thank you for the question and also for the presentations of Anna and Jennifer that I have very much enjoyed, and I will take the opportunity to also build up some of their points. Concerning the question, yes, the Asylum project also explores the so-called external dimensions, particularly third country arrangements, so the increasing use by the European Union and EU member states of non-legally binding instruments such as the EU-Turkey statement. Differently, however, from the PROTECT policy brief, our work actually questions the extent to which the EU-Turkey statement can be a model for future third country arrangements. We take a critical stance. We say that despite many EU official documents present the statement as a good practice and something that it has worked, actually research has amply illustrated how there were many causes for, even again from a quantitative perspective, why the number of people entering from Turkey to Greece and actually going through different European countries decreased in 2016, not least the EU Balkans statement, the Balkans route statement, that at the time President of the European Council Tusk managed to get all those countries in the Balkans to basically literally close their borders and erect new fences. So basically keeping people, in transit and so forth. But also because those instruments raise very fundamental questions from the perspective of the rule of law. Not only judicial control, but democratic accountability as well. And last but not least, look at what has happened, the horrible conditions for people, for the lives and dignity of people that have suffered the consequences of this terrible, in my view, deal between the European Union and Turkey, something that in my view should not be replicated and with any other country, based on and also, how politically vulnerable has left the entire European Union to the Turkish government. It's incredible how this dependency that these arrangements create, that, a country government decides to leave, a couple of hundred people in, and it's a major catastrophe. And it, leads to a major political crisis in the EU. So this is certainly not a sustainable way of going about things. Our research is really mapping all those instruments in the field of readmission and expulsions, and really bringing to light the challenges that they pose from human rights and rule of law. I also wanted to develop on the points raised by both Anna and Jennifer about how the global compacts differentiate the cognitive dimensions of the compacts. Yeah, there are migrants, and the refugees and so forth. And this is interestingly reflected in the pact as well, this cognitive understanding that people can be easily differentiated before they enter between irregular migrants or refugee. And I fully agree with Jennifer's point that, of course, this disregards the complexity of protection, you know, and humanitarian grants that even undocumented people are granted access for humanitarian reasons. And even in the EU, we have the Schengen Borders Code that allows legally governments to do so. So it's really quite mad, frankly. And it is regards to how certain policies co-create irregularity, co-construct irregularity, or co-construct crisis, like the EU-Turkey deal that we've seen, you know, the embarrassment of EU and some national policymakers when Turkey decides to, you know, from one day to another to, you know, take things on their own hands. And but also the point of the Global Compact on refugees. I found Jennifer's point also worth highlighting and developing, because the Global Compact on refugees is not only the Geneva Convention and the protocol, it also expressly mentions regional arrangements, regional approaches to international protection in South America, in Africa, and so forth. So it's fully complementary and acknowledging the differentiation and sometimes wider scoping of international protection in some of the legal and policy frameworks in different regions around the world. So again, it's kind of a mutually reinforcing approach that the Global Compact on refugees by design has, and where I believe is a plus to include, for example, this Calcutta Declaration and other, you know, instruments that uphold protection irrespective where this protection in which region there is.
Thank you, Sergio. So this next question is for Jennifer. Some responses, such as the IK in Indonesia, are likely to be based on religious and cultural traditions. Can such responses be scaled up?
That I think was also my question, which is, I don't know the answer to this. Again, this is some research that was flagged for me and is cited in brief in the paper that I posted in the chat, not to the Zoom call, but to the tablet. I mean, I think that's exactly what the GCR does. If you read the fine print, it identifies promising practices that are already in existence. So education, you know, just having more international students from places that are unstable, where people are fleeing, to the extent that those may not be permanent status spots, but that they can be used for a few years as a temporary spot. Of course, sponsorship is mentioned, community sponsorship in the European sense, private sponsorship in Canada. A number of these individual practices are identified. And again, there are a few references in the paper that I posted that would speak to that, for example, but I am not an expert in it. But it is interesting as an example because it is about customary law. And so it does bridge the legal and the policy and the practice, I think. And so that was the reason for highlighting it.
Thank you. So this next comment was in the chat, and it's not directed to a particular presenter. And I see that Anna has already engaged in a conversation about it. So the individual says, you rightly acknowledge that majority of refugees, migrants, and stateless people reside in the global south, mainly in Africa. Where is then the voice, including in the form of a refugee protection pact, from these parts of the world, and how did it feature in the EU's convention? And I'm not sure if you want to expand on the comments that you already wrote in the chat.
Sorry, was it a question for me to further elaborate? Sorry. I was trying to figure out where is the paper of Jennifer in the Padlet, and I confess I couldn't find it. But no, I'm just saying, I think certainly Gemencio is right that there is a huge power asymmetry, but that I think is the stake with the global compacts, whether the global compacts with their institutionalized and complicated consultations will give a forum and a position for the other countries to participate more actively in the formulation of policies. And I think it's a mixed bag. That's what we're seeing.
Right. Oh yeah, please, Jennifer.
Just one quick point to add to that. In the Calcutta Declaration, the very final point, number 8, actually references, it says, in the context of widespread forced migration and statelessness in Asia, a regime of protection along the lines of the African Charter of Human and People's Rights and its regional systems and institutions is imperative. So just a note that there's a reference there from the Asian perspective of the Africans, that this is good practice that we could pick up on because it includes labor rights. It can include labor rights for migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons. So just one point there.
No, thank you for that addition. Hakan, please feel free to ask your question.
This is rather a replique than a question. I don't want the audience and the speakers to go from here with a wrong impression of what we think about the Turkey-EU agreement. Sergio was referring to that we were rather positive to it. No, not at all. What we are using in our policy brief, if that's where you got it from, Sergio, we are using a very diplomatic language there. We are saying it. We are saying that it's rubbish in very diplomatic words, this is because we got a lot of negative comments from the European Commission itself. I got it, and we had to make the language more diplomatic. What we are saying there, in fact, is that the European Union is proposing now in this new pact a relocation policy within the European Union. This is not international solidarity, this is European solidarity. This is one thing that we're saying. And the second thing that we're saying, if this is going to be an international solidarity, the relocation alternative has to be extended to other countries. And this can be done by also expanding the Turkey EU agreement to be about also asylum seekers that are not yet recognized by the United Nations. This means that put your Turkey EU agreement into the rubbish box and make something new that also includes other countries in the region, neighbor countries in the region, in the relocation arrangement, so that it becomes a real international solidarity. That is the intention of the Global Refugee Compact. Thanks.
Thank you, Hakan.
Thank you. Can I follow up on this point?
Of course.
No, I appreciate that, Hakan, and I think we agree. I mean, when I read it, I would advise that indeed you use more critical language, because it says that it may be a prototype policy model for achieving a broader international burden sharing, and it should be interpreted as a novel yet imperfect extension. So in my view, this is very diplomatic. It's not even diplomatic. It goes to a extent that it may be read as supporting it as a model. But even in the what we've learned from the EU-Turkey statement, even just thinking of resettlement, the idea of 1 for 1, only focused on Syrians. All the evidence and statistics showed it hasn't worked, either purely from a quantitative perspective and then from a substantive perspective. It is discriminatory in the basis of nationality. So, when thinking also, and I come back to the point of Jennifer as well, on the transfer of ideas, the transfer of models and so forth, taking also a critical stance as to, the context and region-specific, geopolitical, social, economic circumstances is also very important. The fact that, and this is what we've been highlighting, that the EU-Turkey statement, even if it, even if you only take the resettlement bit of it and you consider all the rest rubbish, it is still framed in a containment logic. So you have so-called potential legal pathways that they haven't materialized really significantly or substantially, but under a containment agenda, meaning that applying a geographical limitation in Greece, that people cannot leave the islands, undermining the independence of the asylum authorities in Greece, and so on and so forth. So when thinking of, I'm happy that we agree that why is it that this is not a model in the sense of what we've learned since 2016, but even in the context of resettlement, if we take it forward, it will be equally unsatisfactory because it has the purpose there was not to uphold the principles of the Global Compact of Refugees, the principled approach and agenda of the Global Compact. Clearly not. It was really containing people and shifting responsibility away. So, and it is true that in Brussels this is presented as a good practice, but our research and of many of the scholars who participate in our network has showed that has raised that we need to sometimes call things for what they are, while of course using a diplomatic language, but calling things for what they are or what they are not.
Thank you, Sergio. So we will take two more quick questions. So the first one is a general question to any of the panelists. Any concrete examples in the application of the compacts in the management of refugees and migration 2.5 years on since its adoption?
Maybe you can read the second one as well, because we will have really 2 minutes to wrap up the session.
Sure. So our last question is, do you think the GCR's focus on sustainable development in low-income countries is an important part of the solution?
I want to try and take the first question, although I'm not a Global Compact expert at that level. For instance, in the first consultations in December 2019, there was a clear political will to adopt Canada's private sponsorship model in other countries to further boost resettlement. I am not sure that the global, there's been a lot of regional consultations. I'm not sure that the scope of those consultations are to solve the crisis. So like, it's not that we're going to have a consultation in response to Afghanistan or Haiti for that matter. However, I wonder, and if there's anyone in the panel that knows more, I would think that, for instance, consultations in Latin America facilitate the situation with the Venezuelan crisis. And I want to reiterate also that we shouldn't forget all the other things that are happening in the world, because the Venezuelans are still in a dire situation, even while Afghanistan is crumbling. So that is my kind of half answer to this question.
Thank you. So I am conscious of time. Thank you so much to all the presenters and everyone who participated in the Q&A. Again, we can engage on Padlet and continue the conversation. I would also, so we have a very small break, about 10-15 minutes, and I would like to remind everyone that the concurrent panels will start at 12 p.m. and there are different links for each panel. So Idil and Mari, I believe, have added the links in the chat. And then once the panels are over, we will reconvene back in this main room. So you will have to use this original link to join us again for the concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Una. And I would like to thank you again, all the presenters and attendees for being with us and for this very lively discussion. Well, I'll see you in a bit, I hope. Have a nice break and thanks again.